Monsters, werewolves, snakes, skeletons, weird noises, slime, haunted dolls, zombies, spirits of the undead, creatures that creep in the night. It was everything a kid's nightmares are made of, delivered in the most terrifying way they could imagine: books. Hi, I'm Dan Larson, and this is the history of Goosebumps. Goosebumps is a multimedia franchise that began with a series of 62 books written by RL Stine, published between 1992 and 1997. For many kids, it was their first exposure to the genre of horror, and for many more, their first exposure to reading for fun. Robert Lawrence Stine, or R.L. Stine as he is more popularly known, was born in Columbus, Ohio in 1943. He began his journey into writing just 9 years later when he first put his hands on a typewriter. He wrote his own stories and made his own comic books. Despite his mother begging him to go outside and play, he insisted that outside was too boring. Making his own joke books was way more fun. Stine was a self-described comic book freak who loved things like science fiction and EC Comics horror titles like Tales from the Crypt and Vault of Horror. Comics that were scary, shocking, funny, and marketed to kids. In fact, in 1954, the US government targeted EC Comics as what they perceived to be one of the major corrupting forces of America's youth. The pressure was so intense that EC Comics stopped publishing horror comics, and the comics industry created the Comics Code Authority to self-censor and prevent any publisher from doing what EC Comics did. We'll come back to this. Even more than comics, Stine credited his interest in reading and writing to a librarian who knew he was into comics and shifted his attention to the works of Ray Bradbury. In a 2020 interview with Time, he praised what really drew him to Bradbury's work was that they were imaginative and so well written, and all had great twist endings. Thank you to KiwiCo for sponsoring this video. Go to kiwico.com/secretgalaxy to get 50% off your first month of a monthly KiwiCo subscription today. If you're like me, then you spend most of your time on the computer or some other device, interacting with a version of the world that you can't taste, smell, or feel. Living life through apps, pushing buttons that aren't really there. KiwiCo can help bring the search for knowledge, exploration, and interaction into the real world with KiwiCo Crates. Each monthly crate contains a project that is fun, educational, and produces an actual physical object you can continue to use here in the real world. We started working with KiwiCo in 2021, and since then I've built things like a walking robot, a radio, headphones, a soap dispenser, this ukulele, and most recently, Trashkitball. I was NCAA Division III in college. Watch this! KiwiCo offers 5 clubs that span all ages and various interests, designed to advance from project to project along a deliberate path. For instance, KiwiCo Labs is designed with engineering in mind. It's the path for cool things like games and robots. Heads up! So click the link in the description below now to get 50% off your first month of a monthly subscription by going to kiwico.com/secretgalaxy. Again, that's kiwico.com/secretgalaxy. And thanks again to KiwiCo. After graduating from
The Ohio State University.
In 1965, Stine pursued his dream of becoming a professional writer. As he said in a 1996 interview, he moved to New York, started writing humor books, coloring books, and even bubblegum cards. Because, quote, somebody's gotta write that stuff. When you start out as a freelancer, you don't say no to anybody. Stine landed a job with Scholastic, a US-based publishing company, where he wrote dozens of books and founded the magazine Bananas under the pen name Jovial Bob Stine. 72 issues of Bananas were published by Scholastic from 1975 through 1984. 2 years after that, in 1986, Stine wrote his first horror novel called Blind Date, which was a surprise because he had never considered writing horror until a publisher at Scholastic insisted he could write a good horror novel for teenagers. From that same interview with Time in 2020, quote, I didn't know what she was talking about. What is a horror novel for teenagers? So I had to run to the bookstore and buy up a whole bunch of books by Lois Duncan and Christopher Pike and see. Then I wrote this book, Blind Date. It was a #1 bestseller. I thought, wait a minute, forget the funny stuff. Kids like to be scared. I've been scary ever since. Blind Date was the first in a new Scholastic young adult series called Point Horror. Stine continued to write teen horror novels with titles like The Snowman, Beach Party, The Boyfriend, The Babysitter, and The Babysitter 2. In 1989, Stine wrote The New Girl to kick off a new series of teen horror novels called Fear Street. Some of the books were horror, some of them mystery. All of them took Stine back to the bestseller list and reinforced his reputation as a horror writer for young adults. As a side hustle, he put his Jovial Bob Stine hat back on to co-create the TV series Eureka's Castle for Nickelodeon. He was the head writer and helped create the characters, which would end up running 3 seasons through 1991. Stine's wife, Jane, was the co-founder of Parachute Press with Joan Warishaw in 1983. That's the company that produced the books that Stine wrote and then sold to Scholastic. After the success of his teen horror novels, Jane and Joan convinced him to target an even younger audience. As Stine put it in that same Time interview, quote, "No one had ever done a scary series for ages 7 to 11 before, and I wasn't sure it would work. I said, all right, if I can think of a good name, maybe we'll do 2 or 3. Legend has it that fate intervened when Stine saw a print ad that said, "It's Goosebumps Week" on Channel 11, and lo, the path was revealed to him. Goosebumps began as a 6-book contract with Scholastic. The first book, Welcome to Deadhouse, was published in July of 1992. It didn't take long for Stine to find his voice for the Goosebumps series. He has admitted that Welcome to Deadhouse was a bit scarier than it should have been, but by the second book, Stay Out of the Basement, he worked out the magic formula of light horror mixed with humor. Stine wanted to craft stories that were what he called safe scares, like a white-knuckle ride on a roller coaster with dips and curves that always lands without mishap. As he put it in a 1996 LA Times article, quote, "You know how it is going to end before you get on." Stine was a machine of Goosebumps production, writing a book a week, frequently starting with an ending and working back from there. New characters, new settings, new mysteries, and supernatural happenings. Always being careful to stick to self-imposed guidelines about what scary meant in a Goosebumps book. To Stine, that meant keeping one foot in the supernatural. Where his teen horror novels depended on believability, the younger audience of Goosebumps needed fantasy. Things that couldn't actually happen. As he saw it, kids that age already had enough scary things to deal with, like drugs, their parents getting divorced, farting too much, probably. While ghosts are fun to imagine, no one ever actually dies in a Goosebumps book, because that's the line that shouldn't be crossed.
Step right up, ladies and gentlemen, next Saturday morning for a Slappy Sideshow Saturday. Only on Fox Kids. I'm Slappy, and you're in for more thrills than you can possibly imagine. Just think, you'll see all the freakiest Fox Kids creatures in action. So remember, be here next Saturday morning for Slappy Sideshow Saturday on the only place that rocks kids, Fox Kids. You know, you really should try to get some sun.
Stine pulled ideas from any place he could get them, the comics and books he read as a child, movies, stories that he was told, stories that he misunderstood, anything he could think of that might have an angle that could make it scary. Goosebumps took off. Within 2 years, Scholastic had sold roughly 200,000 copies of every title in the Goosebumps series. That was double the volume of the Fear Street books in that same time. The secret, a surprise to both Parachute Press and Scholastic, was that Goosebumps managed to appeal to both girls and boys. Goosebumps not only found the younger audience it was reaching for, but landed across demographics as indicated by the mountain of fan mail they received on a regular basis. On the other hand, adults weren't entirely on board with the new phenomenon. While most were happy that kids were reading by choice, some weren't happy with the choices they were making. Goosebumps were exposing them to violence, they said, as some communities attempted to have the books banned from libraries. Goosebumps are the junk food of children's books, they cried. Goosebumps are the literary equivalent of comic books and should be treated as such, inappropriate for school reading. This echoed the sentiment of the very comic books that Stine himself grew up reading: EC's horror, crime, and mystery comics, Tales from the Crypt, Vault of Horror. Cries of censorship once again rang out in the name of protecting children, like a terrible creature rising up from the grave to haunt him in the future, the reanimated husk of the darkest days of the comics industry. Some parents and educators thought that the content and reading level of Goosebumps books was so poor that, to them, reading Goosebumps was worse than not reading at all. Thankfully, many others defended Goosebumps as a gateway to more complex literature built on a foundation of excitement for the medium. They argued that it was the parents' responsibility to determine what was appropriate for their children, not the government. In 1995, Scholastic expanded the Goosebumps empire with Give Yourself Goosebumps, a series of game books similar to Choose Your Own Adventure, books with multiple alternate endings that varied depending on the choices made by the reader and allowed for multiple reads of the same book written by multiple ghostwriters, taking on the responsibility of the brand and the name RL Stine. That same year, as an indicator of its burgeoning pop culture status, Goosebumps was adapted for television. Fox Kids CEO Margaret Loesch, who had been responsible for some of the most popular kids' television programs in history, recognized the potential of Goosebumps after her own son started reading the books. Some network executives weren't sure that an anthology series was going to work, but it turned out their fears were unfounded as Goosebumps became the #1 rated kids television show in the US for the next 3 years. Most of the episodes were adapted directly from the books. As of this video, many of the episodes are available to purchase officially through various streaming services or unofficially here on YouTube. Goosebumps was a licensing powerhouse with the brand name and various characters featured on a variety of merchandise. School supplies, clothing, puzzles. Hasbro produced a Monster Head maker. Milton Bradley board games like One Day at Horrorland and Terror in the Graveyard. There were handheld electronic video games, collectible figures, and if you can believe it, Pogs. Goosebumps' fortunes peaked in 1996 with 5 million books sold, nearly 130 million since the series began in 1992, likely accounting for around $450 million in sales for Scholastic. And that's when the fervor for the books began to subside, perhaps an indicator of young readers growing out of the series, perhaps moving on to Scholastic's new series, Animorphs. Goosebumps' contribution to Scholastic's revenue dropped precipitously in 1997, as did their stock price, roughly 40%. The reality was that behind the scenes, Scholastic and Parachute were battling for control of the franchise rights and the percentage of hundreds of millions of dollars of profits. See, in 1996, when Scholastic and Parachute signed a new contract, Parachute demanded a greater share of profits and control of merchandising. Scholastic refused. Scholastic had long since stopped being just a publisher. They were essentially a licensing and multimedia company thanks to lessons learned during the success of the Magic School Bus in the mid-90s. Parachute knew a Goosebumps feature film was already being discussed between Scholastic and Fox, and that merchandising was where all the real money was going to be made. Parachute was getting around 33% of merchandise sales and around 7% of book sales. They wanted more, and they had leverage in the form of final say on whether or not a deal goes through. When Scholastic refused to negotiate their percentages, Parachute started declining deals. Down went the movie at Fox, as well as the $30 million promotional tie-in with Pepsi. By the time the two sides came to an agreement, sales were already in the toilet and the damage to the brand was done. In 1998, the original run of Goosebumps books and the television series came to an end as Stine began writing a new series called Goosebumps 2000, which purported to be much scarier than the original books in an attempt to recapture some of those lapsed readers. The legal action dragged into the new millennium and prevented Stine's contract from being renewed in 2000. Publication of all Goosebumps books ceased. It would be 3 more years until the two sides could come to a resolution. In 2003, Scholastic purchased the Goosebumps franchise in its entirety from Parachute for $9.65 million. It was the best solution because, as Jane Stine said in a 2003 article in Publishers Weekly, quote, "We have always been committed to do what is best for the property," and that she was happy with the way things turned out and excited about the future. RL Stine returned to writing Goosebumps books in 2008 with the Goosebumps Horrorland series published by Scholastic. For the first time ever, each book was part of a continuing story that developed a consistent world and featured recurring characters and the vilest villains from the original Goosebumps series. 19 books were published through January of 2011, at which time the Hall of Horrors series replaced it with 6 more books through April of 2012. The new series was supported by the interactive websites EnterHorrorland.com and EscapeHorrorland.com. The game Goosebumps Horrorland was also released for the Nintendo DS, Wii, and PS2. In 2015, Goosebumps finally made it to theaters with Goosebumps starring Jack Black as RL Stine. Sort of. This RL Stine is a writer, but there's also a lot of actual magic involved that binds the creatures in his stories to the pages of the books he writes. The likeness ends at human with glasses. Goosebumps was a box office success, and the sequel, Goosebumps 2 Haunted Halloween, arrived 3 years later in 2018. Jack Black was back, and while it didn't perform as well as the first movie, it was still a commercial success, capitalizing on the 90s kids who grew up with the books, now old enough to bring their own kids to share in the experience. Goosebumps was back on television in 2023, or at least streaming. Like previous adaptations, it featured many of the familiar monsters and ghouls from the books, but with a serialized story instead of starting fresh each episode. 10 episodes were available on Disney Plus and Hulu. Response was strong enough from critics and fans that a second season was greenlit in February of 2024. As of this video, no premiere date for season 2 has been announced, but we do know that it will feature an all-new cast, a new setting, and a new mystery. And that is a perfect way to define the future of the franchise. Billions in sales, the second best-selling book series of all time behind only Harry Potter. As a 90s brand in an era of 90s resurgence with all the ownership rights in one place, the ceiling for production is as high as the audience wants it to go. Technology ruins every mystery, Stine said to Time magazine in 2020. He was referring to the challenge of creating a compelling story. As a writer, he has to find a way to get the phones out of the characters' hands. They lose them or run out of power, or there's no signal. But that's also a good approach for the real world. Stine believes that once you take out the technology, kids are no different today than he was 70 years ago reading horror comics. Because fears never change, and we all get goosebumps. Thanks for watching. Please hit like, hit subscribe if you're not already a subscriber. Thank you very much to those of you who already are. If you're in the position to help the channel grow, please visit our Patreon at patreon.com/toygalaxy. Several different tiers to address your specific Secret Galaxy content needs. Check out our new Secret Galaxy merch shop at secretgalaxy.shop. All merchandise is physically in stock and ready to ship. Links to all of this in the description below, and let us know in the comments down below if you read Goosebumps back in the day or if you picked them up since. I was already out of the age range that the books were intended for when they originally came out. Plus, I didn't really read that many books of any reading level. I too am a self-described comic book freak who indulged in the very books this video described as inappropriate for school reading, but Goosebumps did just fine without me, and I got all my light horror from things like Hellboy, Ghost Rider, and Werewolf by Night. I am a living, breathing example that comic books are perfectly fine for developing reading and writing skills. Thank you very much. Perfect. Another perfect read.